You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, because I hear complete silence and okay.
We're also silent and polite, waiting for things to happen.
Yeah.
Shall we start?
Okay, because I hear complete silence. Okay.
We're also
sure, whenever you want, Karen.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm super excited to be able to welcome Anastasia Loukaitou-Sideris to Berkeley, specifically to the Institute for Transportation Studies and the Department of City and Regional Planning. She is a professor of urban planning and associate dean of the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. She's the author or editor of 9 books on a wide array of topics, and really an expert on transit, on urban design, community development, and with me, actually, she's worked on displacement as well, transit-induced displacement. She's here today actually to present her latest work, which it comes from a book entitled Transit Crime and Sexual Violence in Cities. So this is a book that's a critical reflection on transit crime and sexual violence globally, both in the global north and the global south. And it consists of a number of different chapters that look at the dynamics of transit crime, particularly sexual harassment and violence, from the perspective of those who are most targeted by it, the youth and women. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anastasia.
Yes, thank you very much, Karen, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the Department of City Planning for sponsoring, ITS for co-sponsoring. I wish I were there in person, but I guess this has to wait for the vaccine. But it's a pleasure to be able to share some of my recent work, which is, as the title of my presentation implies, as Karen mentioned, about sexual harassment in transit environments, a topic that seems to be happening all over the world, an issue, a challenge, as I will relate, and as we found. We focused on university students for a number of reasons. I mean, there was the practical reason, because we really studied sexual harassment on transit in 18 cities in 6 continents, and it was easier to reach students through the universities. But also there were 2 other more substantive reasons. One is that students are in an age where we know from the literature that this age group is more sexually harassed than many other age groups. But also it seems that students are typically more transit dependent than the general population in their cities. So for all these reasons, we really focused on students, and I will relate to you our findings. But I'm going to start with something that I guess people from ITS, I'm preaching to the choir, that physical mobility, the ability to move from one place to the other, from one part of the city to the other, smoothly, quickly, without impediments, should be considered an important citizen right, because it does relate to accessibility, the ability to take advantage, to access and take advantage of different amenities in the city, schools, the parks, the shops, but also economic opportunities and jobs. And we know from a number of studies that fear of crime can compromise mobility and accessibility. And this is also certainly true for people who use transit. Fear of transit crime can really compromise their mobility. I have been working on and off on issues of transit crime for the last 20 years. And one of the issues that led me to study bus stops and stations and transit crime settings is because they, and criminologists would tell you that they act as crime attractors. These are settings that can bring together potential victims and potential perpetrators. And they can allow perpetrators to linger anonymously. Nobody is going to ask someone why you're waiting at the bus stop, why you're lingering, right? For certain transit settings, a number of desolate bus stops, they lack guardians, and oftentimes this makes people who are waiting, like this young girl in the picture, quite it generates stress because someone can hang out and kind of start sexual comments or even worse. And the other thing about transit settings is that different types of transit settings facilitate different types of transit crime and harassment. So desolate settings may facilitate a very different type of harassment than overcrowded settings, which might facilitate, for example, groping and touching inappropriately, right? We also know from a literature that I'm part of that there are a number of barriers that affect women's mobility. And a lot of these barriers are historically have affected women's mobility. And some of these are economic barriers, there are social barriers, cultural barriers. I kind of summarize all these in an article called A Gendered View of Mobility and Transport that was published in Town Planning Review. But there are also certainly psychological barriers, and these relate to fear of transit crime and fear of sexual harassment. And these psychological barriers have impacts on women's travel. Sometimes they lead them to avoid public transit, walking, or cycling. I don't think it's a coincidence that we have quite less women cyclists in the United States. They may lead to the avoidance of particular transit settings and particular routes, even if these are the more convenient distance-wise. They may lead to traveling only during daytime, or they may lead a lot of women to travel only if they're accompanied by a friend or someone else. So in 2017, when we started seeing more the Me Too movement in social media and in the press and articles, there was an op-ed in the Washington Post in October 2017. And a quote from this op-ed said the following, that for many, it's a depressing but foregone conclusion. If you're a woman who rides public transportation, you're almost guaranteed to experience the kinds of demeaning or threatening encounters that fit squarely within the bounds of the Me Too conversation. And while I should say this is the case, and a lot of people who use transit know it, sexual harassment in the literature and by scholars has not been that much studied in transit settings. It has certainly been studied on campuses. It has certainly been studied in different work environments, but not so much on transit settings, especially in transit settings in the US. There are a number of studies, by the way, coming from India on sexual harassment. So I think a lot of people know what sexual harassment is, but here is the definition that sexual harassment is any unwanted attention, including lewd comments, leading, sexual invitations, threats, displaying pornographic material, being stalked, followed or pictured, and even public masturbation. And it is different from sexual assault, as sexual assault refers to situations when someone is threatened, coerced, or forced into non-consensual sexual acts. But if we go a bit further, and actually for a survey that we use that I will explain in a bit, we really felt that we needed to be quite specific about different harassment behaviors to also see where these are happening and what are the different settings. We can in general categorize sexual harassment into three different types: non-verbal, non-physical, verbal, and physical harassment. And the physical harassment, of course, involves touching. So what do we know from other studies? We find studies, as I mentioned, and there is a literature that started a few years ago, and it is certainly increasing, that sexual harassment on transit is quite common, but its extent varies. There are studies that report that 21% of the passengers reported being sexually harassed, and other studies say 77% of the passengers. These big variations happen because, number one, there are different definitions of sexual harassment. Number two, some studies ask for lifetime victimization experiences. Other studies may only ask for the last year or the last 3 years. Some studies only ask about the transit vehicle. Others try to ask about the transit stops. And there are also differences because of different sociospatial contexts. We also know from the literature, and that's we actually very recently published a literature review of sexual harassment studies in the Journal of Planning Literature. We know that sexual harassment likely has different effects on people due to individual characteristics. In other words, individual characteristics of victims may affect, or not of victims, of transit riders may affect the probability of them being sexually harassed. And I will explain in a bit. But also the literature leaves a number of questions, a number of gaps, I should say. A better understanding, we need a better understanding of harassment across different individual characteristics, across age groups, race, ethnicity groups, groups of different sexual orientation, different types of transit use, for example, bus or rail. We need also a spatial understanding of where different types of harassment take place. Which types, for example, happen more on transit vehicles, which at transit stations, at bus stops, or even on the routes to and from the station stop. Because as transit riders would be the first to tell you, a transit trip is not only the part on the bus. It starts from someone's home, it ends at someone's destination. So there is a walking or cycling involved, and sometimes even driving, to bring you to the transit vehicle. And we're not very clear also about some of the temporal characteristics, daytime versus nighttime, how they affect the incidence of harassment. We don't know how these individual spatial and temporal factors may interact to affect the risk for harassment. And most of the studies that exist in the literature are case studies of one city or one place. We really lack a direct comparison between different cities and different settings. So this was the rationale for studying this global study that I collaborated with Vanya Sakato. She's a professor in the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And we included 18 cities. This map shows which were the cities that participated in this study that we surveyed students from universities in these cities. And you see that from the US, it was San Jose and Los Angeles, Vancouver in Canada, but you see also a number of cities in South America, Mexico City as well, and some cities in different continents, even including Africa, Lagos in Africa. And here are research questions. We really wanted to know what are the transit safety concerns and victimization experiences of college students in these different cities, how they may vary because of individual characteristics. Now, the students mostly shared similar ages. The vast majority were from 19 to 29. But we really wanted to know how gender, sexual orientation, and in certain cities, race, ethnicity, as well as the physical and social characteristics of the transit setting, how these may be affecting harassment experiences. We also wanted to know how students react to victimization and how victimization from harassment affects students' mobility and transit travel. We wanted to know if students feel the need to take precautions in transit environments and what they perceive as promising strategies to combat sexual harassment and increase safety in the public transit journey. So I'm going to try to summarize, drawing both from some of the Los Angeles and San Jose findings, because I assume they're going to be the most relevant for you, but also we'll try to compare also what we found in these two cities with some findings from other cities. So these are the samples, the sociodemographics of the samples from Los Angeles. We surveyed students from UCLA, Cal State Los Angeles, and Cal State Northridge. And this was a total of 1,284 students and 891 students from San Jose State University. As you see, the Los Angeles sample, we did first the Los Angeles sample, and it was 65% female. We found, even though we sent the survey to all the students that had transit passes from UCLA, and this was about 3,500 students, we had much more response from female students, apparently because it is an issue that is affecting more female students. So for the San Jose sample, we sampled male students, and we ended up with a balanced sample. But I should say that overall, in the global study, we had more female students than male students responding. You see also the race ethnicity characteristics. This was quite a diverse group of students. 16% of the Los Angeles sample indicated an LGBTQI status, and 9% from the San Jose students. You see the ages mostly between 18 and 29. And also I want to underline that these were students that were frequent transit riders, especially in Los Angeles, because we only send it to students who, as I mentioned, had transit passes. But even the San Jose sample, about half of the students were frequent transit riders, meaning that they're using transit at least 3 times a week. So what are our findings? Not surprisingly, female students are significantly more fearful than male students while traveling. This was a universal finding. Every fear of crime survey, fear of crime in public spaces, typically finds women expressing more fear than men. Here are some descriptive statistics. This is the percent of students who said that they often or always feel safe after dark on the bus. You see that all cities, men, indicated by the orange bars, feel considerably higher percentages of men feel safer. This is a statistically significant difference, all the t-tests showed, than women. You see where Los Angeles and San Jose fare. They seem to be, especially San Jose, interestingly enough, students that smaller percentages of students than students, let's say, in Stockholm or Tokyo, Paris, that said that they always feel safe. This is a difference the differences in Los Angeles between men and women. Again, you see that men, now indicated in the brown bars, often say they feel often or always, higher percentages of men often or always feeling safe after dark. I should say that the differences during the daytime were not that statistically significant. And that leads also about 10% of the students not using the bus after dark at all. These are some results by race. Again, a kind of an interesting finding is that you find white students overall more often saying that they feel safer. A second finding, which was again not particularly surprising, we found that sexual harassment is a routine experience for student transit riders, especially for women, but its extent varies by city and transit setting. We definitely found in all cities many more women students saying having been harassed over the last 3 years, at least in one of the 16 different behaviors that we asked them. What was surprising was that in some cities, we also found considerable amounts of male students saying they have been harassed, and mostly their reports involved verbal harassment. So we found roughly twice as many women in San Jose, for example, students, as men reporting verbal and non-verbal harassment. Women were more likely to have been physically harassed. Women were much more likely than men to take almost every type of safety precaution when using transit. But we found substantial numbers, and that was surprising, of men who were affected. And here are the differences you see, and that was true for all cities. Verbal harassment, sexual comments were the most significant. Again, you see women more affected than men, but you see 36% of male students saying also being affected by verbal harassment. Physical harassment, thankfully, was the smallest amount, but still 16% of female students, 8% of male students saying having experienced physical harassment. This is the Los Angeles study. We found 83% of the female students that we asked said that they have experienced at least 1 out of 16 different categories of sexual harassment over the last 3 years in a transit setting. The differences, I will check statistically, and I will talk about that in regards to sexual orientation. Here in Los Angeles, you see that 77% of LGBTQI students mentioned that they have been harassed versus 71%. But when we broke down the results between lesbian students and gay men students, significantly more lesbian students were affected. We had very few trans students, so we could not do any significant analysis. In terms of the global study, here you see how Los Angeles and San Jose, the two US cities, fare compared to others. Again, you see women much more affected by men on the bus system, by harassment, but you also see the tremendous differences, let's say, from cities like Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Manila, Lagos, and Los Angeles, where more than 80% of female students say they're being harassed, versus cities like Tokyo, that less than 15% of female students indicated harassment on the bus. And this is on the train. In most cities, most harassment was happening on the buses than the trains, but we had cities like Paris, and that was actually Paris ranked the #1 city in the Parisian metro in terms of women harassment. Significantly much more. It mostly pushes 90% compared to a little bit over 30% for men. Again, cities in Southeast Asia like Guangzhou and Tokyo have much less incidence of sexual harassment. This shows the quartiles in the bus system, in the rail system, how these 18 cities scored. You have less cities in the rail because some cities did not have rail. You also see the box plots on the right-hand side. One thing to notice is, in general, cities of the global south seem to have more degrees of sexual harassment. than cities of the global north overall. It also shows that there was more overall harassment on the bus than on the rail. A third finding was that the impact of harassment on different subgroups of LGBTQI students needs more studying. Number one, we were not allowed to ask about sexual orientation in a number of cities, including cities of Western Europe, like France or Italy. And also when we asked, the subsamples were often quite small, and especially if you started kind of teasing out who is by gender, who is lesbian, who is gay, who is trans. But I will, in Los Angeles, where we had a significant number of LGBTQI students, I will report on some results. This shows the descriptive statistics for LGBTQI students versus straight students. I think 9 out of 12 cities where we were able to get data show a bit more harassment of LGBTQI students in 9 out of 12, but in a few cities, the differences were not statistically significant. And one thing to remember is that sexual orientation is often not visible, right? A fourth finding was that most harassment incidents are officially never reported. And this was, we were suspecting that, but the numbers were quite shocking. So from the students, and in some cities, the many students who reported that they had experienced victimization from sexual harassment, very small percentages reported this harassment. In Los Angeles, it was only 10%. The only exception were more than half of the students, actually about 68% of the students, where we saw higher numbers of reporting, was in Guangzhou, China. And again, remember, this is a city that doesn't have that much harassment. The reason why students who were victims did not report varied. A lot of them said they were embarrassed. A lot of them said that they felt they may be accused of attracting harassment by the way they were dressed or whatever. A number of them were suspicious of the police. A number of them felt that nothing much is going to happen. Some of them said they don't know how to report. And some of them, and this was sad, felt that, well, it's not a big deal. In other words, you know, this type of behavior had become normalized. It was happening so often, they didn't feel that it was something noteworthy to report. And even from those students who reported, from the 10%, let's say, of Los Angeles students who reported the harassment incident, most of them reported to friends and family. Very few of them would report to the police or the transit operator or the bus driver, for example. A fifth finding is that students report that if there are bystanders, and many times there are people around that notice the harassment, they typically look away. They do not act. And this is actually known to some transit agencies. This is from a poster from a campaign that WMATA in Washington, D.C. did, that they called a bystander campaign, that encourages people, if they observe something, to try to do something, to try to sidetrack the harasser, or to say something, or to text themselves to Metro, a particular app that they have, to report the incident. A sixth finding is that sexual harassment reduces transit use and leads to precautions. And this is the number of people who said that they would travel only during daytime. And of course, this is for choice riders, for people who have the option to get Lyft or Uber or, you know, their own car. But if you think of the captive riders, they also really need to find ways. And actually, the most common response, and this was across many, many cities, is dressing a certain way. Women riders feeling the need to dress a certain way as to not attract attention. 53%. 51% said they would wait for transit only at well-lit places. And this is from San Jose, the responses. The brown are female, the blue are male students. Again, always you see female students taking more precautions. Travel only during daytime, the most common response. Wait for transit only at well-lit places. Dress a certain way. Hold keys to protect myself. By the way, this was a characteristically US response of female students saying they feel the need to carry some kind of weapon, most often not a gun, but either a small knife, pepper spray, keys being used as a protection. We did not find this among females in other countries. A seventh finding, that students believe that certain design and policy improvements would help reduce harassment and make them feel safer. And here is the responses from San Jose. Students were asking about cameras at bus stops, more lighting at bus stops, police patrolling at bus stops. I have to say that that survey was done before the George Floyd killing. And even though that was done before, some open-ended responses, that because we asked students to comment on every question, and we got a lot of comments, where a number of students, especially minority students, were asking for no more police. And I will show you a little clip of a video that we prepared of how, for transit operators, how to make transit safer against sexual harassment without increasing policing. An eighth finding is that certain individual characteristics of students and physical and social characteristics of settings influence the risk of harassment on transit. And I want to now go more explicitly and talk about some more advanced statistical analysis that we did for the Los Angeles model. The N was 1,284 students. The dependent variable was sexual harassment victimization on transit. And we did two models, one for the bus, one for the rail. And we really wanted to see how individual characteristics such as gender, sexual orientation, race. We didn't have enough African American in the sample, so we did not have African American. Age, and this was a dummy between less than 30 or over 30, because about 1/4 of the sample was over 30. The frequency of transit, if people use transit at least 3 times a week, and long commute, over 30 minutes, how these individual characteristics may affect the risk from harassment, how physical environment characteristics, if the most common transit setting that students are using, they feel it's poorly illuminated, poorly guarded, or if it has vandalism, graffiti, or litter, how these physical environment characteristics may relate to incidents of harassment, and how social environment characteristics, the presence, let's say, of panhandling or drunk use or sales in transit settings, or the presence of drunk people. And if you're interested in this study, you can find it. It has been published right now online and will appear in press soon at JPER. And I'm not going to show you, the tables with the regression models because the numbers are simply too many. But here are the variables that were significantly associated with increased likelihood of victimization. For both the bus and the train models, the most important variable, not surprised there, was gender. LGBTQI was also a significant variable. In both models, presence of drunk people and presence of panhandling. These 4 variables were significant for both bus and train models. For the bus model, the long commute and poor illumination of bus stops were significant. And for the trained models, the presence of vandalism and litter, the frequency of transit use, and being white, which was a little bit surprising to us. So we also did interviews with transit operators in Los Angeles, 5 or 6 different transit operators, because we wanted to know if they know about the issue and what they do about it. And we were quite surprised to find that the vast majority of these transit agencies did not perceive harassment to be a significant problem on the system, even though we found that it is extremely significant among particular female students. And because they don't perceive it to be a significant problem, they have very few strategies that are being directed towards combating harassment. I should say that there was only one agency, and thankfully that's the largest agency, which is the Los Angeles Metro, that has become aware of the issue. They started asking about, on their online surveys, they started asking, putting a question, have you been sexually harassed for the last few years? They still get few, all these agencies said, well, we don't get any report. So how would we know that this is an issue? The other issue is that transit agencies focus only on experiences on the transit vehicle and pay little to no attention to experiences at transit stops or on the route to or from the transit stops, because they're not directly responsible for these settings. So only Metro has added a question, and actually they also started and completed a landmark study. I was privileged to be a consultant for the study about how women travel. And all the agencies seem to over-rely on reporting as a way to measure the extent of the problem. And we saw that reporting, very small percentages of students reported the harassment. So how can we enhance women's mobility by reducing harassment? What should happen? As with many wicked problems, we need multi-pronged approaches that involve research, design, policy, and technology. In terms of research, we need to emphasize more gender issues in mobility research. We need to develop appropriate methodologies for data collection. We need to include questions about sexual harassment on passenger surveys. We need to collect data for the full transit journey, understand the transportation needs of different subgroups, and analyze intersectionality issues, and disseminate our findings beyond the academic communities. And this is kind of a table about particular strategies, what type of strategy, and who is the responsible actor and what is the objective. But instead of kind of talking about particular strategies in general, I want to show you a 1 minute plus clip of a video that we put together for transit operators of how you can increase traffic safety without policing. And let me. Okay. Let me come back to. Oops, no, I don't want that. Sorry. Okay, here we go. I stopped sharing my screen. Let me go back. I wanted to give credit to a number of people, and I have a slide about that. Okay, can you see my screen? I hope you can. So where to find?
We can't see it, dear.
Oh, you cannot?
No.
Okay, let me try to share it again. Share. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, let me go from slide, play from current slide. Before we go into the, oops, here. Play from current slide. Oops, I don't know why I'm doing that. I guess, let me go back. Sorry, sorry about that. This is where to find the work Karen talked about. The book. It has chapters for each of the cities, as well as a number of different chapters on precaution, on intersectionality, on the impact of the built environment, on methodologies for global studies, etc. But there are also different articles, published in these various planning and criminology journals. You can download the UCLA study and the San Jose study at these links. And I want to finish with acknowledging that there have been a number of collaborators for the Los Angeles study, a number of my PhD students, the San Jose study with Asha Weinstein, Agrawal, and also Cristina Tortora is a professor there and a student. Vania Secato, I mentioned, from the Royal Institute of Technology. And my many thanks to Caltrans and the UCLA ITS and the Mineta Transportation Institute for supporting the study. So let me stop sharing my screen. And okay, here we go. And we can open it for questions or comments.
I can kick us off. I'm very curious about the differences between rail and bus. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that in LA, but also elsewhere around the world.
Sure. And one of the differences, both in LA and San Jose, was that we were finding more harassment. Now, you have to think about the different settings, right? For example, a lot of harassment, especially verbal harassment, happens at the bus stop. So the bus stop is a less controlled setting than the station, right? Where it is, a much more enclosed, oftentimes more surveyed type of environment, while the bus stops are very much a public setting. So that's one issue. The second issue is where you have more crowding. Because different types of harassment, especially touch types, are very much facilitated by overcrowding. And at least in Los Angeles, there is much more overcrowding in the bus than on the train. In Los Angeles, we know that there is also some differences in the sociodemographics. So lower income folks use the buses more than the trains. So there are all these differences, and they play out in different ways. As I mentioned, there were 3 cities that, and prominently Stockholm and Tokyo, Stockholm and Paris, that they see more sexual harassment on the rail than on the bus. And everybody else, the bus riders experience more incidents of harassment. And I say that there are a number of things, but a number of these have to do with the characteristics of the setting and the characteristics of crowding and also desolate settings, because different types of harassment happen under different facial characteristics. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hello. Do you think there is a correlation between the report of sexual harassment and sexual harassment? Do you think that where the cities where more people are reporting sexual harassment are actually the cities where less people are experiencing sexual harassment?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole. If there is a correlation between sexual harassment and what?
And the report of sexual harassment.
Oh, the reports. You know, I cannot say that because the reports were so very minimal, and I would say that in most of the cases, people do not report. So there is no way of knowing if they don't report, and they don't report because of a number of reasons, but oftentimes, and I have seen that with bus stop crime that I was studying in the past, and not with harassment, that a lot of people, for example, from the Latino community would not report pickpockets, etc., because they were very suspicious. They were fearful of the police. So they would not report. This does not mean that pickpockets don't happen. And the same thing does not mean that sexual crimes and sexual harassment don't happen. So I would not say that there is a big correlation between reporting and harassment. If anything, we found a little bit of the opposite. We found in Guangzhou, where we see higher numbers of reporting compared to the other 17 cities, we saw some of the lowest numbers of harassment.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say. Do you think that more is the number of reports of sexual harassment, less is people experience sexual harassment?
I cannot say that because I have not measured it, so it needs further studying. I know it might not be a satisfactory response, but we have not measured it, so I cannot say that the opposite is true, but it was true for Guangzhou.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this really interesting and important talk. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the way that this might be changing due to reductions in transit ridership related to COVID-19. And I know that you saw that bystanders often don't help, and I don't remember seeing a ridership level factor in your model, but just wondering if you have any thoughts on how this might relate to concerns related to reduced ridership and ways to mitigate.
Yes, it's funny, but I'm right now conducting a study on homelessness in transit environments, and I'm talking to many different transit agencies, and the common observation that they are reporting is that all of them saw huge decreases in transit ridership and increases in homelessness because public libraries are closed and because shelters are at capacity. And so you have less ridership overall, but more ridership of homeless population. And also some first respondent population. But overall, they do report less riders. So I have no idea. I have not studied sexual harassment under COVID. But if there is, I know that there is a relationship between particular type of physical harassment, groping, and high ridership numbers. So if that's the case, we see lower ridership numbers, so probably we see less groping. But beyond that, I cannot say much.
Thank you.
Can I ask what is known about the harassers as opposed to the harassed? For example, is it just a small number of very frequent offenders, or is it many people, things like this?
That's an excellent question. And the answer is that we know almost nothing about the harassers, unfortunately, because there is underreporting, because a lot of these, and even the penal code, the California Penal Code, is not considering harassment a lot of the categories of the 16 categories of harassment that I've mentioned are not in the penal code. The penal code only pretty much looks into sexual assault and not sexual harassment. So as a result, you don't, and it is an very interesting topic, but it's also a difficult to study topic because you would not have subjects coming up and saying, I'm a harasser. And so it's difficult to find these individuals and have them talk to you. And I know that there have been studies about rape, and in this case, you know, if there is a raper and this person is being goes through the criminal justice system, there have been a few studies that talk to rapers, but not. I'm not aware of any study that looks into harassers because but it's a very good question. Also, I should add that in many countries, especially verbal harassment, especially sexual comments, looks, leering, and all that, it is very, very, very common. I'm talking a lot about countries in Southern Europe, South America, etc. So there is an overwhelming number of male population of certain age may be sexual harassers. So it's not one particular type as well.
I know there are certain kinds of sexual offenses where you have some kind of lifetime restrictions on where you can live and so on. Do you know offhand whether those extend to whether you can take transit?
I'm not sure about that. Yeah, if you're a registered sexual offender, you cannot live near a school or a park. I'm not sure about transit, though. I would think not. I don't think that that's actually a good point, but I don't think it exists right now. Something, I'll have to look into that. It's usually to protect children. They have to be away from schools and parks, but I'm not sure about the transit settings. And yet it is a very common setting for harassment.
One last question from Karen, I think.
Okay.
Hi, Anastasia. It's wonderful to see you. Really important research. Thank you so much. I'm definitely going to be including this in my future teaching and studios. We just we're finishing up a studio where the students were interviewing bus drivers, particularly in this context of COVID, and not a lot of people on the buses or on the trains. And so curious if anything's come up on driver safety and senses of security, particularly for women and other groups.
No, we have asked actually transit agencies if they train their bus riders on how to react and respond. You know, it has not been elevated as an issue for a number of transit agencies. And yet, I mean, in some of the proposals, we're saying that there are a few things that bus riders could do. First of all, there could be a few agencies around the country, and certainly in other countries, they have this request stop programs that the rider can let someone get off, even if there is not a bus stop, especially at certain times at night. It is up to the driver to decide if he or she can do that. And that would help minimize oftentimes the exposure of, from the bus stop to your home at night where someone can stalk you, etc. So that's something that the drivers can do. Also, kind of a number of female students, when we were asking them, what precautions are you take? Some of them say, I sometimes try to sit as close to the driver as possible. And so you can think about, having a couple of seats that could be, as we have for older population or handicapped, disabled population, that, some seats can be near the driver. But it would require some training also, I would think. And we say this in some of our reports and our proposals that, the drivers now. the other part of the story, of course, is that the drivers often have to do a lot. I mean, there is the issue about homelessness, for example, and other drivers who are house drivers but are misbehaving, and this sexual harassment and all that. So if you hear the drivers, this is not something that I think they would welcome, that they're on the spot and they have to deal with this issue as well. But I think it could be helpful, especially the request stop programs that the drivers could do. Yeah.
Great. I think we need to stop here, but thank you all for such great questions, and let's all give Anastasia a hand and thank her for coming to
Thank you. Really great, and the questions were great too. So
yeah, right? Yeah. So, and you have a standing invitation to come back. So.
Okay, I hope in person at some point.
Yes, right.
Okay,
Okay, thank
good.
you. Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.